The arsenic bottle slipped from Margaret O'Sullivan's trembling fingers, shattering against the wooden floor of the Triple Bar Ranch house. In the doorway stood Daniel Mackenzie, his gray eyes burning with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that would haunt him forever. "Tell me it isn't true, Maggie." His voice cracked like winter ice. "Tell me you didn't." But the truth hung between them, heavier than Colorado mountain snow. 6 months of shared warmth, stolen kisses, and whispered promises, all built on the grave of a murdered man. Margaret's dark hair cascaded over her shoulders as she sank to her knees, her silk nightgown clinging to curves that had driven him to madness. "Dan, please, let me explain." The wind howled through the valley, carrying secrets that should have stayed buried in Boston. In the frontier, a man's past could kill him. But what about a woman's? This story starts in the dead of winter, but the cold isn't the only thing that can freeze a man's heart. December 1885. The San Luis Valley lay buried under 3 feet of snow, and Daniel Mackenzie was slowly losing his mind. Not from the cold, not from the cattle dying in frozen fields, but from a loneliness that ate him like acid. At 26, he owned 800 head of prime beef and 2,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Colorado Territory. A king in a kingdom of ice and solitude. But success meant nothing when you had nobody to share it with. 3 years since his father died. 3 years of talking to no one but his aging foreman, old Pete, and the cattle. 3 years without a woman's touch, a woman's laugh, a woman's warmth in his bed. The silence of the ranch house was a living thing, a ghost that sat at his dinner table and watched him sleep. The ride into Silverton Creek took 2 hours through knee-deep drifts. Dan's breath frosted in the air as he tied his mare to the hitching post outside Brennan's boarding house. He needed supplies: salt pork, coffee, ammunition, the usual things a man needed to survive the winter. What he didn't need, what he never expected, was her. Margaret O'Sullivan sat in the front parlor like a queen holding court with ghosts. She wore a black wool dress that seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light, a dress that emphasized every curve of her mature figure. Auburn hair was pinned up to reveal a swan's neck that begged for a man's lips, and her eyes. Her eyes were the color of new spring leaves, and they held secrets deeper than any mine shaft in the territory. She was reading a book of poetry. Poetry, in a frontier town where most folks couldn't spell their own names. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her, feeling a pull he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just lust, it was something else. A sense of recognition, a sense of danger. "Ma'am," Dan finally managed, touching his hat brim. She looked up and something electric passed between them. It wasn't about faces, it was about needs. About hungers that had gone unfed for far too long. "Sir," her voice carried the refined accent of eastern cities. "Boston, maybe, or Philadelphia." A voice that had no place in this rough, God-forsaken valley. "Daniel Mackenzie, I own the Triple Bar spread, about 10 miles north. Margaret O'Sullivan." She closed the book, her finger marking her place. "Recently widowed." The way she said widowed sent a jolt through him. It wasn't said with sorrow. It was said like a statement of fact, like closing a ledger on a bad debt. "I'm seeking employment, domestic work." A widow. Here was a woman who understood loss, a woman who might understand the vast, aching emptiness of his life. "What kind of domestic work?" His voice came out rougher than intended. A small, knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth. It was a smile that said she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Cooking, cleaning, managing a household." She paused, her green eyes locking onto his. "Whatever a man might need." The way she said "whatever" sent heat straight to his groin. This wasn't some blushing farm girl afraid of her own shadow. This was a woman who knew the world, a woman who knew men, a woman who knew exactly what she was offering, and he knew in that moment that he was already lost. "Winter's hard up at the ranch," Dan said, trying to sound careful, trying to sound like a sensible rancher, and not a man drowning in sudden, desperate want. "Isolated, just me and my foreman." "I'm not afraid of isolation, Mr. Mackenzie." Her gaze was unwavering. Sometimes it's preferable to complications. Ruth Brennan, the owner of the boarding house, appeared with a tray of tea, her eyes darting between them. She was a notorious gossip, and by nightfall the whole town would be talking. Dan didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the gnawing ache of loneliness. He felt alive. The work would be steady through spring. Room, board, and $20 a month. 30. She didn't blink. He should have negotiated. Any sensible businessman would have. Instead, he found himself nodding like a schoolboy with his first crush. 30 it is. When can you start? Tonight, if you'll have me. Those words, spoken in that husky, educated voice, nearly broke his composure. If you'll have me. It sounded like a prayer and a challenge all at once. Dan cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. I'll ready the buckboard. Loading her single, heavy trunk, he caught the scent of her perfume. It wasn't the simple lavender or rosewater he was used to. It was something darker, more exotic. Musk and spice and secrets. It made his hands shake as he secured the canvas cover over her belongings. The ride back to the triple bar passed in a charged silence. Snow fell in fat, silent flakes, blanketing them in a strange intimacy. Margaret sat close beside him, her hip pressing against his thigh with every bump and rut in the trail. He was achingly aware of her breathing, of the way she tucked a wayward strand of auburn hair behind her ear, her gloved fingers brushing against the delicate shell of it. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to see if she was real. As they crested the hill overlooking his spread, she finally spoke. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone older, more, settled. The triple bar stretched before them, the long, low ranch house, the sturdy barns, the sprawling corrals. All his, built by his father's hands in his own sweat. But seeing it now through her eyes, Dan felt its emptiness like a physical ache. It wasn't a home, it was just a collection of buildings. I've been settled too long, he admitted, his voice low. Maybe it's time for some unsettling. She turned to study his profile in the fading light. A strange look crossed her face, a flicker of something he couldn't name. Sadness? Regret? Or maybe it was a warning. Careful what you wish for, Mr. Mackenzie, she said softly. Some kinds of unsettling can destroy a man. He should have paid attention to that warning. He should have recognized the danger in her tone, the shadow in her eyes, but he didn't. All he could think about was how her lips would taste, how her skin would feel against his, how her voice would sound whispering his name in the dark. He was a starving man, and she was a feast, and he was too hungry to ask if the meal was poisoned. Old Pete emerged from the bunkhouse as they pulled up to the main house. His weathered face was a mask of skepticism. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the beautiful woman sitting beside his boss. This is the new housekeeper, Pete, Dan said, his voice a little too loud. Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan, Mrs. O'Sullivan, my foreman, Pete Rawlings. Pete touched the brim of his hat, but his eyes stayed wary. Ma'am. Mr. Rawlings, she replied, her voice smooth as cream. I'll help with your things, Pete offered. But it wasn't a friendly offer. It was a duty. As they unloaded her trunk, Dan noticed again how little she'd brought. One trunk. For a woman starting a new life, it was almost nothing. It wasn't the luggage of a traveler. It was the luggage of a fugitive. A woman fleeing something. But fleeing what? Or who? I'll show you to your room, Dan said, leading her inside. The moment she stepped across the threshold, the house felt different, warmer, more alive. The ghosts seemed to retreat into the corners. Margaret moved through the rooms as if she belonged there, her fingers trailing lightly over the rough-hewn furniture, the stone fireplace, the worn door frames. It's beautiful, she breathed, standing in the center of the main room. A real home. The way she said it, with a deep, primal longing, as if she'd been searching for a home her entire life, made something twist in Dan's chest. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her, to give her the safety and peace she was so clearly craving. Standing at the foot of the stairs with her looking down at him from the landing, he felt the immense weight of both possibility and danger. He had just invited a complete stranger, a woman of secrets and shadows, into the heart of his solitary world. He had no idea that he hadn't just hired a housekeeper. He had just sealed his fate. Margaret O'Sullivan proved to be everything Dan had dreamed of and nothing he'd prepared for. In a matter of days, she transformed the Triple Bar from a bachelor's hollow cave into something approaching civilization. The dust and neglect of 3 lonely years vanished under her capable hands. The meals were the first sign. They became events. Venison steaks and a rich wine sauce he didn't know could exist. Biscuits so light they practically floated off the plate. Apple pies that made old Pete, a man who hadn't shown emotion since the day Dan's father died, weep with silent gratitude. She mended his clothes with delicate, almost invisible stitches. She organized the cupboards with a military precision that was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. She filled the house with the clean scents of beeswax, lavender, and baking bread. But it was the small intimacies, the unintentional moments of grace that drove Dan to distraction. The way she hummed while kneading bread dough, her body swaying to some internal rhythm that made his blood pound in his veins. The way she would bend to stoke the fire, giving him a fleeting glimpse of a silk stocking beneath her lifted skirts. The habit she had of loosening her hair before bed, running her fingers through the heavy auburn waves while standing silhouetted in her bedroom doorway. She was a constant, simmering presence in his house, a low-grade fever that he never wanted to break. And she knew it. She had to know it. The glances she gave him over the dinner table, the way her fingers would accidentally brush against his when she handed him a cup of coffee. It was a slow, deliberate seduction, and he was a willing victim. Old Pete watched it all with a grim, disapproving silence. He'd corner Dan in the barn, his voice a low growl. "You're a fool, boy. You know nothing about her." "I know she's a good worker," Dan would retort, his face flushing. "She's working on you is what she's doing," Pete would spit. "A woman like that don't end up in a place like this by accident. She's running from something. And whatever it is, it'll find her. And you'll be standing right next to her when it does." Dan would brush it off, telling himself Pete was just a lonely old man, jealous of the life suddenly blooming in the once dead house. But late at night, Pete's words would echo in his head. Margaret had nightmares. He would hear her sometimes, a muffled cry from her room down the hall. And once, he heard a name, spoken in a choked, terrified whisper. Patrick. Her husband, he assumed. The one who had died of pneumonia. But she didn't sound like a grieving widow. She sounded like a cornered animal. Christmas Eve arrived with a blizzard that buried the valley in a profound, almost holy silence. The world outside ceased to exist. It was just the three of them, isolated on the Triple Bar. Pete had retreated to the bunkhouse with a bottle of whiskey, leaving Dan and Margaret alone in the main house. Dan found her in the parlor, curled in his father's big leather armchair, a book in her lap and a glass of brandy in her hand. The firelight painted gold highlights across her skin and turned her hair to molten copper. "Merry Christmas," she said, her voice a low murmur. She lifted her glass to him. Dan poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat in the chair opposite her. "Not much of a celebration. I've had worse." A shadow flickered across her face, there and gone in an instant. "At least here, I'm wanted." Wanted. The word hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with unspoken meaning. Margaret set down her book. More poetry, he noticed. She studied him with those unsettling green eyes, a faint, curious smile on her lips. "You're a puzzle, Daniel Mackenzie. A young man with an old man's ranch. Handsome enough to have your pick of the girls in town, but you live up here like a monk." The whiskey burned a welcome path down his throat. "Maybe I'm particular. Or maybe you're afraid." "Afraid of what?" In one fluid motion, she rose from the chair and moved to stand before him. She was so close he could count the faint freckles dusting the bridge of her nose. So close he could smell that exotic, intoxicating perfume on her skin. "Of wanting something you can't control." Her hand came up to rest on his chest, her fingers spreading over the frantic beating of his heart. Dan's breath caught in his throat. "I'm not some little farm girl who will swoon at a few pretty words, Daniel," she whispered, her voice husky. "I'm a woman. I know what I want." "And what's that?" he managed to ask, his own voice hoarse. Instead of answering, she kissed him. It was soft at first, a gentle testing of boundaries. But when he responded, his own desperate hunger rising to meet hers, the kiss deepened. Her tongue slid against his with a practiced, devastating skill that spoke of experience he could only dream of. His control, the iron discipline he'd lived by for 3 long years, shattered like winter ice. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against him, feeling every soft curve through the thin fabric of her dress. She tasted of brandy and promises, of sin and salvation. She tasted like everything he'd been starving for. She finally pulled back, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her lips swollen and damp. "I should go to my room." "Should you?" Dan's voice was a ragged whisper. Her smile was pure, unadulterated sin. "That depends. Are you brave enough to follow?" She turned and walked away, her hips swaying with a deliberate, maddening rhythm, leaving him standing there like a man who had just been struck by lightning. Dan Mackenzie lasted exactly 3 minutes before he went after her. It was the longest 3 minutes of his life. He found her standing by her bedroom window, still fully dressed, but she had taken the pins from her hair. It cascaded over her shoulders like a river of dark fire in the moonlight. The snow-covered landscape outside turned her skin to porcelain. "I was wondering if you'd come," she said without turning around. "I shouldn't be here," he said, the words feeling foolish and hollow as soon as they left his mouth. "No." She turned to face him then, and her eyes were liquid fire. "You shouldn't." But she was already unbuttoning her dress. Her fingers moved with a deliberate slowness that was both agonizing and exquisite. The dark wool whispered to the floor, pooling around her feet. She stood before him in her chemise and stockings, a vision from a dream he'd been too afraid to have. The fabric fell away, revealing curves that made his mouth go dry. Full breasts that rose and fell with her quickened breathing. A waist he could span with his 2 hands. Hips that spoke of womanliness, of experience, of the kind of pleasure he'd only read about in forbidden books. "God, Maggie," he breathed. She came to him then, pressing her body against his clothed one, a study in contrasts. Her hands, surprisingly strong, worked at the buttons of his shirt. "I've been alone for so long, Dan," she whispered against his throat, her breath hot on his skin. "Don't make me be alone tonight." What followed was not gentle. It was fire and whiskey and a desperate, clawing need. Dan had been with women before, saloon girls in dusty towns who traded their bodies for a few coins. But this was different. This was a collision. Margaret gave herself to him not like a gift, but like a challenge. She met his rough urgency with a ferocity that stunned him. She responded to his touch with gasps and sighs that drove him wild, pulling him deeper into a world of sensation he never knew existed. She guided his hands, teaching him what she liked, showing him pleasures he had never imagined. When it was finally over, they lay tangled in her narrow bed, her head resting on his chest, their bodies slick with sweat. He could feel her heartbeat slowly returning to normal against his ribs. Outside, the blizzard raged, but in that small room, there was only a profound, exhausted peace. "Stay," she whispered into the darkness. He should have gone back to his own room. He should have maintained some pretense of propriety, of being the employer, and her the employee. He should have done a lot of things. Instead, Dan pulled the heavy quilt over them both and held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, the scent of their lovemaking. "Maggie," he said after a long silence, the question that had been nagging at him for weeks finally surfacing. "What really happened to your husband?" He felt her body go tense against him, a subtle, almost imperceptible stiffening. "He died," she said, her voice flat. "Pneumonia, that's all." A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind. "What else would there be?" she asked, her voice still carefully neutral. But there was something in her tone, a rehearsed quality, a brittleness, like a sheet of ice stretched too thin. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that she was lying. "Nothing," Dan said finally, letting it go. "For now, nothing at all." Margaret relaxed against him again, her breathing gradually evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. But Dan lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm. He was holding a beautiful, passionate, wonderful woman in his arms, and he was suddenly, terrifyingly sure that she was also a complete and total stranger. A stranger with secrets dark enough to have driven her 1,000 miles from home. Winter deepened its grip on the San Luis Valley, and Daniel Mackenzie fell deeper under Margaret O'Sullivan's spell. Without discussion, without a single word being spoken, she moved her things from the small guest room into his master bedroom. She brought her lavender scent and her midnight whispers into his life, filling the spaces he hadn't even known were empty. Dan had never known such contentment. The ranch had never run more smoothly. The days were filled with the hard, honest work he'd always known, but now they were punctuated by the thought of returning to her. The nights were filled with a passion so fierce it sometimes frightened him. She met his hunger with an equal hunger of her own, teaching him that a woman's desire could burn as hot and as bright as any man's. She was a storm and a safe harbor, all in one. One morning in early February, he was watching her braid her long auburn hair at his mirror. The early morning light caught the red highlights, making it look like spun fire. He was overwhelmed by a sudden, powerful wave of emotion. "Marry me," he said. Her hands stilled. The half-finished braid hung over her shoulder. "Dan, I mean it." He rose from the bed, the cold floorboards doing nothing to cool the heat inside him. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder and looking at their reflection in the mirror. They looked right together. "Come spring, we'll get the circuit preacher up from Alamosa. We'll make it proper." In the mirror, her green eyes met his, and for a second he saw it again. A flicker of something vulnerable, something hunted. It was quickly hidden behind a soft smile, but he had seen it. "You don't know me well enough for marriage, Daniel." "I know enough." His lips found the sensitive spot just behind her ear. "I know you taste like honey in the morning. I know you cry out my name when I touch you. Just so." He moved his hand to her stomach, pulling her back against him. "I know you're the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. To me." Her body was soft and warm in his arms, but he could feel a tension in her, a subtle resistance. "And if you learn things about my past, things that might change your feelings?" Dan turned her around to face him, holding her by the shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes, trying to pour all of his sincerity, all of his love, into his gaze. "Maggie, I don't give a damn about your past. I only care about our future." She smiled then, a real smile that almost reached her eyes. "My sweet, trusting Daniel." The words were meant to be loving, but they sounded almost sad. That afternoon, while Margaret was outside hanging laundry on the line, the bright colors a stark contrast to the white snow, old Pete pulled Dan aside. He had that grim, stormy look on his face again. "Boss, we need to talk." They walked to the barn, the cold air biting at their faces. Pete didn't waste any time. "It's about your woman." "Careful, Pete," Dan warned, his voice low. "No, you be careful." The old foreman's voice was sharp, sharper than Dan had ever heard it. "I was in Silverton yesterday, picking up supplies. Got to talking with Ruth Brennan." Dan felt a familiar, cold knot forming in his stomach. "And?" "And Ruth's been doing some talking of her own. Seems Mrs. O'Sullivan, before you hired her, asked a lot of strange questions. Asked the doc about symptoms for certain ailments. Specifically, she was mighty curious about arsenic." Arsenic. The word hung in the frigid air of the barn. "So?" Dan tried to sound dismissive. "Maybe she was worried about rat poison around the house." Pete shook his head, his expression grim. "That ain't all. Ruth's got a cousin back in Boston. Works as a clerk for the city police. Ruth, being the busybody she is, wrote to him, asked him to look into a Mr. Patrick O'Sullivan. Died last September." The cold knot in Dan's stomach spread through his chest, making it hard to breathe. "What did she find?" Pete took off his hat and twisted the brim in his weathered hands. "Man died sudden-like. A rich Irish merchant, older fella, married nigh on 15 years to a much younger woman. No children. The official cause was gastric fever." Pete looked up, his eyes boring into Dan's. "But the symptoms, They match arsenic poisoning almost exactly. By the time anyone got suspicious enough to think about looking closer, the pretty young widow was already gone, headed west. Dan stared at the old man, his mind reeling, refusing to connect the dots. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about protecting you, boy." Pete's voice was raw with a fierce, paternal loyalty. "This woman shows up out of nowhere, beautiful as sin and twice as tempting. Gets her hooks into you so fast you don't even see it coming. Makes you stop thinking with your brain and start thinking with what's in your pants." "That's enough, Pete." But even as Dan said it, the pieces were clicking into place with a sickening finality. Margaret's nervousness whenever the mail arrived from back east, her careful, subtle questions about the local sheriff and how the law worked out here, the nightmares, the name Patrick whispered in fear, not sorrow, her strange warning on the ride to the ranch. Some kinds of unsettling can destroy a man. He remembered something else. A few weeks ago, he'd been cleaning out the tack room and had come across a small, locked metal box tucked away in a dusty corner. He'd assumed it was something of his father's and hadn't thought much of it. But now... "Where is she now?" Pete asked, his voice softer now. Dan looked toward the house. Smoke curled from the chimney, a comforting, domestic sight. The laundry danced on the line. Margaret was in there, in his kitchen, probably preparing another perfect meal, ready to welcome him home with soft kisses and even softer curves. His Maggie, a murderer. "I don't believe it," he said, but the words sounded weak, even to his own ears. "Then prove me wrong," Pete challenged. "Search her things, ask her direct. But don't you go on being a blind fool, Dan. Don't you let her destroy you." Dan was already walking back to the house, his boots crunching in the snow. Pete's words echoed in his head, a brutal, relentless rhythm. "Makes you think with your brain. Makes you think." He didn't go to the kitchen. He went to the tack room. The small metal box was still there, tucked behind a stack of old saddles. It was locked, just as he remembered. He didn't have the key. He didn't need one. He took a crowbar from the wall and pried the lid open with a single violent wrench of his arms. Inside, nestled amongst a small bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon in a few pieces of elegant, expensive-looking jewelry, was a small brown glass bottle. The label was still legible. It had a skull and crossbones on it. And one word: arsenic. The truth was a physical thing. He could hold it in his hand. It was cold and heavy and undeniable. He walked back into the house, the bottle clenched in his fist. He found Margaret in the kitchen, just as he'd pictured. Flour dusted her apron, her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the stove, and she was humming that same little tune she always did. Domestic perfection, all curves and competence in feminine grace. A beautiful lie. "You're early," she said, smiling brightly at him. "Supper won't be ready for..." Her smile faltered as she saw his face, as she saw the bottle in his hand. All the color drained from her cheeks. The humming stopped. The cozy warmth of the kitchen evaporated, replaced by an Arctic chill. "Dan, I need to ask you something." His voice was dead, devoid of all emotion. He held up the bottle. "But I think I already know the answer." Something in his tone, in his eyes, made her stiffen. "What is it?" Dan studied her face, searching for any sign of innocence, any crack in the facade, but he found none. Only a sudden cornered fear. "How exactly did your husband die, Maggie?" Her rolling pin stilled on the dough. Her knuckles were white. "I told you. Pneumonia." "Did he suffer?" "Daniel, why are you doing this?" "Did he suffer, Margaret?" he repeated, his voice rising, cracking the dead silence. She set down the rolling pin with a slow, careful precision, as if it were made of glass. She untied her apron and folded it neatly, placing it on the counter. Her movements were calm, deliberate, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. She looked him straight in the eye. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He suffered." A long, terrible pause. "But not from lung fever." When she finally spoke again, her voice was clear and cold and utterly without remorse. "He suffered from arsenic poisoning." The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. Jesus Christ, Maggie. Let me explain, Dan. You have to let me explain. Explain what? That you're a murderer? That you poisoned your husband and ran? That you've been lying to me since the moment we met? The questions poured out of him, fueled by 6 months of love and a moment of devastating betrayal. Yes, her chin lifted, a flicker of defiance in her eyes even as tears began to stream down her face. I killed him. The kitchen, his kitchen, the heart of the home she had created, suddenly felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. This woman who had shared his bed, who had whispered sweet promises to him in the dark, who had healed the lonely, broken parts of him he thought could never be fixed. She was a killer. Why? The word came out broken, a shard of his shattered heart. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the kitchen table for support. Because he was killing me, she said, her voice cracking with a pain so raw it stunned him into silence. Slowly, for 15 years. He was killing me with his fists, with his cruelties, with his disgusting demands. Our marriage wasn't a marriage. It was a prison sentence. And every day he was my jailer. So you poisoned him. It wasn't a question. It was a condemnation. I freed myself, she corrected, her voice gaining strength. I chose to live. Dan backed away toward the door, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and horror. The woman he loved, the woman who made him feel alive again. She was a poisoner, a cold-blooded killer who had planned her husband's death, watched him suffer, and then fled to save her own skin. How do I know you won't do the same to me? The question was a poison of its own, twisting between them. When you get tired of me? When a richer man comes along? Her face crumpled then, the defiance replaced by a look of pure agony. Because I love you, you fool, she cried out, her voice breaking into a sob. Don't you see? For the first time in my miserable, pathetic life, I actually love someone. I love you, Daniel. But what was love from a killer? Was it love at all? Or was it just another kind of poison, a sweeter, slower acting one that would destroy him just as surely in the end? Outside, the wind howled like all the demons in hell, screaming a warning he had been too deaf with loneliness to hear. And just as he was about to turn, to run from the house, from her, from the terrible truth, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, the crunch of hooves on snow, multiple horses, coming fast. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a new, more immediate terror. It wasn't the look of a spurned lover. It was the look of a hunted animal that knows the hounds have finally cornered it. They found me, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. Oh God, Dan, they found me. Before Dan could process what was happening, there was a loud, authoritative knock on the front door. It wasn't Pete. It was the sound of the outside world, the world of law and consequences, breaking into their isolated fortress. Who was they? Who had found her? He thought Pete's discovery was the climax of this nightmare. He was wrong. It was just the beginning. The arsenic bottle sat on the kitchen table between them, a small dark god in their shattered temple. Margaret had retrieved it from her trunk without being asked, her movements strangely calm, almost resigned, despite the tears that continued to stream down her pale face. I kept it, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the bottle, not on him. Insurance, I suppose. A way out, in case the past ever caught up with me. Dan couldn't take his eyes off the small brown bottle. Such an innocent-looking thing to hold such deadly power. To have the power to end a life, to end a marriage, to end the world he had so carefully, so foolishly, built with this woman. I should turn you in, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Yes, she agreed, her voice flat. You should. Another thunderous knock echoed from the front door, more insistent this time. A man's voice called out, muffled but firm. Mrs. O'Sullivan, I know you're in there. We have a warrant from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Massachusetts. It was real. This wasn't just Pete's suspicions or a letter from a gossip. This was the law reaching all the way across the country to his doorstep. The law is looking for you, he stated the obvious, his mind still struggling to catch up. I know. You used me, he accused, the betrayal a fresh, sharp pain. You came here. You seduced me. All to hide. To keep yourself safe. Margaret flinched as if he'd struck her. She finally looked up from the bottle, her green eyes swimming with a desperate sincerity. At first, she admitted, her voice choked with shame. At first, it was about survival, finding a place where no one would look for a rich merchant's widow. But not after, Dan. Not after that first night. Never after that. He thought about the past months, her laughter in the morning light, her gentle hands tending to a cut he'd gotten while mending a fence. The way she had transformed his hollow, empty house into something that felt like a paradise. The nights she had held him through his own nightmares. The ones about his father, whispering that he was a good man, that he was worthy of love. Was it all a lie? A calculated performance by a cunning killer? Or was it possible for two truths to exist at once? That she was a murderer, and that she also loved him. If I let you go, he said slowly, the words forming before he had even consciously decided on them. Can you promise me you'll never kill again? I swear it, she whispered, her gaze locked on his. Open up, Mackenzie. The voice from outside boomed, followed by the sound of a heavy boot kicking the door. Don't make this difficult. And if you stay, she said, her voice dropping, filled with a desperate, trembling hope, then I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving to you that I am more than the worst thing I ever did. Outside, he could hear old Pete's gruff voice arguing with the strangers. Pete was trying to protect him. Pete had been right all along. 3 miles through the snow to town, that's what Pete had been ready for. 3 miles to turn in the woman who'd saved him from his own loneliness, only to drag him into her own personal hell. He made a decision. It wasn't a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between the life he had and the life he wanted, a life that was now inextricably tangled with hers. Dan snatched the arsenic bottle from the table. Margaret didn't flinch as he strode to the cast-iron stove and, wrenching open the firebox door, threw it into the heart of the roaring flames. There was a sharp crack as the glass shattered, and the flames flared for a moment with a sickly, deadly green light. The evidence was gone. He turned back to her. Patrick O'Sullivan is dead, he said, his voice hard, authoritative. Margaret Mackenzie has never existed. As far as anyone knows, you came to Colorado a widow named Maggie, and you will leave this life as my wife. The front door suddenly splintered and burst inward. Two men stood framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the driving snow. One was the local sheriff, a man named Brody, looking deeply uncomfortable. The other was a tall, severe-looking man in a city suit and a bowler hat, his face pinched and pale from the cold. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the warrant. Daniel, I'm sorry, Sheriff Brody started. This is Detective Finch from Boston. He has reason to believe. Before he could finish, Dan stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between the lawmen and Margaret. He was no longer the lovesick rancher. He was the master of the triple bar, defending his home, defending his woman. You're trespassing, Sheriff, Dan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. And you, mister, he said, locking eyes with the detective. You've come a long way for nothing. There's no one here by the name of O'Sullivan. Detective Finch's eyes narrowed. He looked past Dan at the beautiful, terrified woman standing by the kitchen table. That's her, Finch said with cold certainty. That's Margaret O'Sullivan, the woman who poisoned her husband for his fortune. A fortune? That was new. Margaret had never mentioned a fortune. Dan glanced back at her. Her face was a mask of pure terror. It wasn't just fear of the law. It was fear of this man. This specific man. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. This wasn't just about a murder investigation. This was something else entirely. I think you gentlemen should leave, Dan said, his hand dropping to rest casually on the butt of his Colt. Now. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The sheriff looked nervously from Dan's hand to Finch's determined face. The next few seconds would determine everything, and Dan Mackenzie realized he was willing to go to war for a woman he now knew was a killer. The question was, what other secrets was she still hiding? And who was this Detective Finch, really? Detective Finch took a step into the room, his cold eyes never leaving Margaret. He ignored Dan completely, as if the rancher was nothing more than a minor obstacle. "It's over, Maggie," Finch said, his voice surprisingly soft, but laced with a chilling menace. "Did you really think you could run forever? Did you think I wouldn't find you?" The use of her first name, the familiarity in his tone, sent a fresh wave of ice through Dan's veins. This wasn't a detective talking to a suspect. This was personal. "I don't know who you are," Margaret said, her voice trembling but firm. She took a half step back, closer to the rack of kitchen knives on the wall. "Oh, I think you do," Finch said with a thin, cruel smile. He turned his attention to Dan, finally acknowledging his presence. "Mr. Mackenzie, you've involved yourself in something far above your pay grade. This woman is not who you think she is. She didn't just kill her husband. She stole from him a great deal of money. Money that belongs to his business partners." "I don't see any business partners here," Dan growled. "I just see a man from Boston threatening a woman in my home." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Now, Dan, let's all just calm down. Finch has legal authority." "His authority ends at my door," Dan cut him off. "Unless you're willing to die for him, Sheriff, I suggest you stand down." The threat was naked, unequivocal. Old Pete suddenly appeared in the broken doorway behind the lawman, a double-barreled shotgun held loosely in his hands. Its twin muzzles pointed vaguely in their direction. The situation had escalated from a tense standoff to the brink of a bloodbath. "This is my ranch, Sheriff," Pete said, his voice a low rumble, "and the boss just asked you to leave." Finch's eyes darted from Dan to Pete, then back to Margaret. He was a city man, used to asserting his will through paper and procedure. Out here, the only law that mattered was the one that came from the barrel of a gun. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "This isn't over," he snarled, taking a reluctant step back. "I'll be in town. I'll be watching. You can't hide her forever, Mackenzie. The moment she steps off this property, she's mine." He turned and stalked out, disappearing into the swirling snow. Sheriff Brody gave Dan a helpless, apologetic look before following him, leaving the splintered door swinging in the wind. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Margaret's ragged breathing. Dan kicked the broken door shut and turned to face her. The immediate danger was gone, but the questions remained, bigger and more terrifying than before. "A fortune?" he asked, his voice quiet, deadly. "Business partners? Who the hell was that man, Maggie?" She collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, her face in her hands. Her sobs were harsh, guttural sounds of pure, abject terror. "His name is Finch," she wept. "He's not a detective." Dan waited, the silence stretching. "Then who is he?" She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a horror that went beyond the fear of a simple arrest. "He was my husband's partner," she whispered, and the confession landed with the force of a second, even more devastating blow. "And he's not here for justice, Dan. He's here for the money. The money I was supposed to help him steal from Patrick." The story she told then, in halting, terrified pieces, was a nightmare. Patrick O'Sullivan hadn't just been a cruel husband. He and Finch were criminals, running a smuggling and extortion ring out of the Boston shipyards. They were brutal, ruthless men who had built a small fortune on the misery of others. "Patrick was a monster," she said, her voice gaining a desperate, pleading edge. "But Finch is the devil. He enjoyed the cruelty. Patrick wanted money, but Finch wanted fear. The plan had been simple. Finch had grown greedy. He wanted Patrick's share of the money, and he wanted it all. He had coerced Margaret into helping him, threatening to expose her to Patrick's violence in a way that would surely get her killed if she refused. The plan was to poison Patrick, make it look like a natural death, and then Margaret and Finch would split the hidden fortune. "He gave me the arsenic," she confessed, looking at the stove where the bottle had been destroyed. "He taught me how to use it, a little each day, in his brandy, to mimic the symptoms of a gastric illness." But Patrick had become suspicious in his final days, not of her, but of Finch. He'd realized his partner was planning to betray him. In a fit of paranoid rage, he had turned on Margaret, accusing her of being in league with Finch, beating her half to death. He told me he was going to kill me that night, she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched a faint, silvery scar near her hairline that Dan had never asked about. He said he would kill me, then take the money and disappear before Finch could get to him. It was him or me, Dan. I knew he meant it. So, that night, I didn't give him a small dose. I gave him the rest of the bottle. She had watched her husband die in agony, and then, terrified that Finch would kill her next to get the entire fortune for himself, she had taken what little personal money she had and fled. She didn't take the fortune. She didn't even know where all of it was. She had just run, as far and as fast as she could, ending up in a desolate boarding house in the middle of a Colorado winter. Dan sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of her confession pressing down on him. She hadn't just killed an abusive husband. She had been entangled in a dark, violent world of crime. She had been a pawn in a game between two monsters and had saved her own life by committing a monstrous act herself. So Finch thinks you have the money, Dan said, piecing it together. He thinks you double-crossed both of them and ran off with the whole score. Yes, she sobbed. And he will never stop looking for it. He will never stop looking for me. He won't just turn me into the law. He'll kill me, Dan. Slowly. He'll make sure I suffer. He looked at this woman, this complete stranger he had fallen in love with. A killer, an accomplice, a fugitive. His entire world had been turned upside down in the space of an hour. The simple, honest life he had craved was gone forever. In its place was a web of lies, murder, and stolen money, with a man who was likely a far more dangerous killer than Margaret ever was, now waiting just a few miles away. Old Pete was standing by the door, the shotgun still in his hands, having heard every word. His weathered face was impossible to read. Dan looked from Pete's grim expression to Margaret's terrified one. He had a choice. He could throw her out, hand her over to Finch, and wash his hands of the whole bloody mess. He could try to reclaim his simple, lonely life. Or he could accept that his life was never going to be simple again. He reached across the table and took her trembling hand in his. Her skin was ice cold. He's not getting you, Dan said, his voice quiet but filled with a resolve of forged steel. This is my ranch. This is my home. If Finch wants you, he's going to have to come through me to get you. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man with something to protect. And he was about to find out just how far he would go and what lines he would cross to keep the woman he loved safe from the devil who had come to collect his due. The Triple Bar Ranch became a fortress. The blizzard that had brought Margaret to him now served as their jailer and their protector, cutting them off from the world and cutting the world off from them. But they all knew the snow wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the path to Silverton would clear, and Finch would be waiting. The days that followed were filled with a strange, surreal tension. On the surface, life went on. Margaret still cooked, her hands moving with the familiar grace, but now there was a tremor in them he couldn't unsee. Dan and Pete still tended to the cattle, their faces grim, their conversations short and practical. But under the surface of this domestic routine, a war was being planned. They talked late into the night, huddled around the fireplace, the shadows in the room dancing like ghosts. Dan learned more about Margaret's past, and the more he learned, the more his simple, black and white morality bled into shades of gray. He learned about the 15 years of casual cruelty, the psychological torment, the constant fear she had lived with. He learned that her husband, Patrick, had not just been a criminal, but a connoisseur of suffering, a man who had delighted in breaking her spirit, piece by piece. He used to lock me in the cellar for days, she told him one night, her voice a monotone, as if she were speaking of someone else. Forgetting a dish at dinner, for speaking out of turn. He would tell me the rats were his little pets, and that they'd tell him if I was being ungrateful. Dan listened, his heart aching, his anger a cold, hard knot in his gut. This wasn't an excuse for murder. It was a reason. He was falling in love not with a cold-blooded killer, but with a survivor. A woman who had been pushed to the absolute edge and had found the strength to push back. His desire to protect her solidified into an ironclad certainty. He would die for this woman. Old Pete was their strategist. The years had not dimmed his sharp, practical mind. This Finch fella, Pete said, cleaning his shotgun by the firelight. He's a city predator, used to back alleys and hired thugs. He ain't used to this. Pete gestured with the barrel of his gun toward the vast, empty wilderness outside the windows. This is our ground. He comes here. He plays by our rules. They planned for every contingency. They scouted locations. They stockpiled ammunition. They turned the ranch house, the barns, the very landscape itself into a potential weapon. The peaceful triple bar, Dan's inheritance, his sanctuary, was being transformed into a killing field. One afternoon, Pete found Dan in the barn, staring out at the snow-covered fields, his face a mask of worry. "You're in this deep, boy," Pete said, not as a criticism, but as a statement of fact. "I know," Dan replied, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "There's something I ain't told you," Pete said, his voice low. "Something about me. The reason I was so suspicious of her from the get-go." Dan turned to look at him. "What is it?" "Before I came out west, before I met your father, I wasn't a ranch hand. I was a U.S. Marshal, worked out of Boston for a few years." Dan stared at him, stunned into silence. Old Pete, his father's loyal foreman, the man who had taught him how to rope and ride, had been a lawman. "I left the life," Pete continued, his eyes distant. "Too much gray, not enough black and white. But I never forgot the names. When she said O'Sullivan, it rang a bell, a faint one. Patrick O'Sullivan. He was small time back then, but the whispers were there. Him and another fella, a real snake named Finch. They were bad news. I never had enough to bring 'em in, but I knew what they were." "Why didn't you tell me?" Dan asked, his mind reeling from this new revelation. "Wasn't my place, and I had to see what kind of man you were. Had to see if you were strong enough to handle the truth when it came. Your father, he was a good man, but soft-hearted. You're made of something harder. You got your mother's iron in you. I reckon you're gonna need it." The revelation settled between them. Pete hadn't just been a suspicious old foreman. He had been testing him, watching him, waiting to see if he would break. The trust between the two men, already strong, deepened into an unspoken bond. They were in this together to the bitter end. A week after Finch's arrival, the weather broke. The sun came out, bright and cold, and the long, slow process of the thaw began. The path to town would soon be clear. The ticking clock was getting louder. The first sign of trouble came not from the road, but from the herd. One morning, Dan rode out to find two of his best cattle dead, shot clean through the heart. It wasn't the work of a rustler. A rustler would have taken the meat. This was a message, a taunt. Finch was showing them he could get close. He could touch them whenever he wanted. He was a spider, spinning his web, and the ranch was now caught in it. The psychological warfare had begun. The dead cattle were just the beginning. A few days later, the small dam that fed their water trough was sabotaged, flooding the lower pasture. It was a slow, deliberate campaign of harassment designed to fray their nerves, to make them jump at shadows. Finch was enjoying this. He was a cat playing with his food before the kill. Dan's anger grew with each new provocation. He wanted to ride into town and face Finch head-on, a direct confrontation between two men. But Pete held him back. "That's what he wants," the old marshal cautioned. "He wants you angry. He wants you sloppy. He wants to draw you off your own land, into his territory. We wait. We let him come to us. We make him play our game." Margaret was becoming a ghost. The terror was a constant companion, visible in the dark circles under her eyes, the way she would start at every creak of the floorboards. She barely ate, barely slept. She spent her days watching the road from an upstairs window, a Winchester rifle never far from her hands. She had killed once to survive, and Dan could see in her eyes that she would do it again without hesitation. One evening, as Dan was securing the barn for the night, he saw it, a flicker of light from the ridge overlooking the ranch, a lantern signaling, and a moment later, an answering flicker from another ridge on the opposite side of the valley. Finch wasn't alone. He had brought help. He was surrounding them. The time for waiting was over. The game was about to begin. Dan ran back to the house, his heart pounding. "He's coming," he said, bursting into the kitchen where Margaret and Pete were sitting in silence. "He's got men with him. They're on the ridges." Pete nodded slowly, his face grim but calm. "It's time then." He stood up and took his shotgun from its place by the door. "Maggie, you stay here. Keep the doors barred. Don't open them for anyone but me or Dan. You hear me?" She nodded, her face pale but her expression resolute. She picked up the Winchester, her movements sure and steady. "Dan," Pete said, turning to him, "you take the barn loft. You got a clear line of sight to the front of the house and the road. I'll take the rocks up by the creek. They'll have to come through the valley between us. We'll have them in a crossfire." The plan was simple, brutal, and their only chance. As Dan climbed into the hayloft, the familiar smell of hay and leather doing little to calm his racing pulse, he looked back at the house. He could see Margaret's silhouette in the upstairs window, holding the rifle, watching, waiting. He thought of the life they could have had, the simple, peaceful life he had offered her. It seemed like a dream from another lifetime. The moon rose, full and bright, bathing the snow-covered valley in an ethereal, ghostly light. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. It made the open ground as bright as day. There would be nowhere to hide. For hours there was nothing, only the sound of the wind, the distant cry of a coyote, the frantic beating of his own heart. The waiting was a torment, a slow tightening of a wire around his chest. And then he saw them, 3 figures on horseback, moving slowly down the road from town. They were silhouetted against the snow, dark and menacing. One was clearly Finch, tall and thin in his city coat. The other 2 were rougher-looking men, hired guns by the look of them. They stopped at the gate to the ranch, 100 yards from the house. They sat there for a long moment, surveying the scene. The quiet house, the dark barn, it looked peaceful, sleeping, a perfect trap. Then Finch dismounted. He walked toward the house, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in the middle of the yard, halfway between the house and the barn. "Mackenzie!" Finch's voice cut through the silent night air. "I know you're in there. I have a proposition for you." Dan sighted down the barrel of his rifle. Finch's chest was a clear target. He could end this right now, with one shot. But he hesitated. This was murder. Cold-blooded murder. "Send out the woman," Finch shouted. "Send her out with the money, and my men and I will ride away. No one has to get hurt. You can have your ranch back. You can go back to your pathetic, lonely life. Just give me what's mine." Dan's finger tightened on the trigger. "You have 1 minute, Mackenzie," Finch yelled. 1 minute to decide if she's worth dying for." From his position in the rocks, Pete fired his shotgun into the air. The blast echoed through the valley like a clap of thunder. It was the signal. The 2 hired guns, startled by the shot, drew their pistols and spurred their horses toward the house. They were riding right into the kill zone. From the barn loft, Dan opened fire. His first shot caught one of the riders in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse with a cry of pain. The other rider fired wildly toward the barn, the bullets thudding into the wooden walls around Dan. From the rocks, Pete's shotgun boomed again. This time, it wasn't a warning. The second rider screamed as he was blasted from his saddle. Finch, caught in the open, dove for cover behind the water trough, pulling out his own pistol. He fired toward the house, trying to pin Margaret down. A window shattered upstairs. Dan swiveled his rifle toward Finch. He had a clear shot. But just as he was about to fire, the wounded rider on the ground raised his pistol and fired at the barn. The shot went wide, but it kicked up a cloud of snow and dirt that momentarily obscured Dan's view. In that split second, Finch bolted. He ran, not toward the road, but toward the side of the house, disappearing into the shadows where Dan couldn't see him. He was trying to get inside. "He's going for the house!" Dan yelled, hoping Pete could hear him. He scrambled down the ladder from the loft, his heart in his throat. He had to get to Margaret. He ran across the open yard, the remaining hired gun, now on foot, firing at him. A bullet whizzed past his ear. Dan didn't slow down. He fired his own pistol as he ran, driving the man back behind his fallen horse. He reached the back of the house and saw what Finch was doing. He was at the kitchen window, trying to pry it open with the barrel of his gun. Dan raised his rifle. "Finch!" The man from Boston spun around, his face a mask of rage and surprise. He fired his pistol. Dan felt a searing, white-hot pain in his left arm. He stumbled, his rifle falling from his suddenly numb fingers. Finch smiled, a predator's smile. He started walking toward Dan, raising his pistol for the kill shot. I told you she wasn't worth it, Rancher. Suddenly, the back door of the house flew open. Margaret stood there, her face pale in the moonlight. The Winchester rifle pressed to her shoulder. Her expression was not one of fear. It was one of cold, absolute fury. Get away from him, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Finch laughed. What are you going to do, Maggie? Shoot me? You don't have it in you. You're just a frightened little sparrow. I killed my husband, she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. And you are a much, much worse man than he ever was. Before Finch could react, she fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the back porch. Finch staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face. A dark stain blossomed on the front of his fine city coat. He looked down at his chest, then back up at Margaret, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. Then he crumpled to the ground. Silence. The battle was over. One of the hired guns was dead. The other was wounded and trying to crawl away. And the devil from Boston lay dead on the back porch of the Triple Bar Ranch. Dan leaned against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm, looking at Margaret. She was staring at Finch's body, the rifle still held at the ready. She had done it again. She had killed to protect her life, to protect her home, to protect him. Pete came running up, his shotgun in his hands. He took in the scene at a glance. Finch's body, Dan's wound, Margaret standing over them like an avenging angel. It's over, Dan breathed, a wave of dizziness washing over him. No, Pete said, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the ranch. It's just getting started. What are you talking about? Dan asked, confused. Finch is dead. Finch wasn't the real problem, Pete said grimly, helping Dan to his feet. He was just the errand boy. The real problem is who he worked for, and the money. We still have to deal with the money. And that's when Dan understood. They hadn't won anything. They had just survived the first wave. By killing Finch, they had just declared war on a criminal empire 1,000 miles away. And now they had a dead body, a wounded man, and a whole lot of questions to answer for the sheriff. Their nightmare was far from over. The aftermath was a blur of adrenaline and pain. Pete, with the cold efficiency of a seasoned lawman, dealt with the situation. He tied up the wounded hired gun, a lowlife named Miller, and retrieved Finch's body. Margaret, her face set in a grim mask, tended to Dan's arm. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his bicep. It was painful, but not critical. As she cleaned the wound, her hands were steady. He looked at her, at this woman who had just saved his life, who had killed for him. The line between survivor and killer had vanished completely. She was simply his Maggie. We have to get our story straight, Pete said, his voice urgent as he joined them in the kitchen. The body of Finch was now wrapped in a canvas tarp in the barn. Sheriff Brody is going to be here by sunup. He's not a fool. They spent the next hour concocting a story that was true but not the whole truth. They would say Finch and his men came to the ranch, claiming Margaret was a fugitive, that they had tried to take her by force, to extradite her without legal paperwork. They would say it was a shakedown, that Finch was after money he claimed her husband owed him. They would say they had defended themselves. It was a plausible story. In the Wild West, claim jumpers and extortionists were common. A man had a right to defend his property and the people under his protection. The key was Miller, the wounded hired gun. He's our witness, Pete said. He needs to tell the sheriff the same story we do. Pete went to the bunkhouse where Miller was tied to a chair. Dan and Margaret waited, the silence in the kitchen thick with unspoken fears. They heard raised voices, then a single, muffled cry of pain, then silence again. When Pete returned, his face was grim. He'll cooperate, was all he said. Just as the sun began to cast a pale gray light over the valley, Sheriff Brody arrived with a posse of 3 men. He took in the scene: the dead man by the creek, the wounded man in the bunkhouse, the shattered windows of the ranch house, Dan's bandaged arm. He listened to their story, his face unreadable. He interviewed Miller, who, with a new collection of bruises on his face, meekly confirmed every detail. He was just a hired hand, he claimed, paid to provide some muscle for a debt collection. He didn't know the man Finch was going to get violent. Brody looked at Finch's body. He saw the expensive suit, the city shoes, the soft hands of a man who didn't do honest work. He also found a warrant in Finch's pocket, but it was for a Margaret O'Sullivan, a name that meant nothing to him. The woman in the house was Maggie, Dan Mackenzie's housekeeper. In the end, it was one man's word against another's, and Dan Mackenzie was a respected landowner. Finch was an outsider, an unknown. Brody's loyalties were with his own people. "Looks like self-defense to me," Brody declared finally, much to Dan's relief. "This Finch fella came looking for trouble, and he found it." He turned to Dan. "But this is a mess, Dan. A federal warrant, even a questionable one, is going to bring questions down the line. My advice? You and your housekeeper should make things official. Mrs. Daniel Mackenzie is a lot harder for some Boston lawman to track down than a Maggie the housekeeper." It was a warning and a piece of advice, a way to bury Margaret O'Sullivan for good. After the sheriff and his posse had taken the bodies and the prisoner away, an exhausted peace settled over the Triple Bar. The immediate threat was gone, but the shadow of Patrick O'Sullivan's criminal enterprise still loomed. "The money," Dan said to Margaret as they stood on the porch, watching the posse disappear down the road. "You said you didn't take it. Do you have any idea where it is?" She shook her head. "No, Patrick was secretive. He had dozens of hiding places. In our house in Boston, in his offices at the wharf. It could be anywhere." "Finch's bosses will think you have it," Pete said, joining them. "They won't stop. They'll send someone else. Someone smarter and more dangerous than Finch." They were living on borrowed time. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. That spring, just as the last of the snow melted from the high country, the circuit preacher came through the valley. In a simple ceremony in the ranch house parlor, with only Pete as their witness, Daniel Mackenzie and Margaret O'Sullivan were married. As she said her vows, her green eyes never left his. She was no longer a fugitive. She was a wife, a rancher's wife. She was home. For a while, life was good. The cloud of fear began to dissipate. They worked the ranch, they built a life together. They loved each other with a fierce, protective passion forged in violence and secrets. The Triple Bar began to prosper like never before. Dan bought more land, more cattle. Margaret transformed the ranch house into a true home, filled with warmth and laughter. They were happy, but the past is never truly buried. One day, about a year after the wedding, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Margaret Mackenzie, but the postmark was from Boston. Her hand trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a small, ornate key and a single sheet of paper with an address on it. A bank in Boston. "It's from my mother," Margaret whispered, her face pale. "Before she died, she told me that if anything ever happened to her, a letter would be sent. Patrick forced her to hold on to something for him, a safety deposit box. He trusted her more than anyone. The key, the money, the source of all their troubles. It had found them. We have to go back," she said, looking at Dan, her eyes filled with a new dread. "We have to get it. If we don't, they'll never stop looking for us. We have to get it and make it disappear." Dan looked around at the life they had built, their home, their peace, and he knew she was right. To truly be free, they had to go back into the lion's den. They had to return to Boston, confront the ghosts of her past, and finish what she had started the day she picked up that bottle of arsenic. Their life in the peaceful Colorado Valley was over. The final act of their violent story was about to begin, and there was no guarantee they would both make it back alive. If you've been captivated by Dan and Maggie's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because their journey is far from over. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Until next time, remember that sometimes to find peace, you have to go to war.